Gary DePaul with Unlabeled Leadership. Welcome to episode 52. Patrick Ward explains the return for giving up control. Here's a shout out to those in France and the provinces of Hauts-de-France and Ile-de-France, and also to those in the city of Nairobi in Kenya. With that, let's get started. If you happen to be in the Los Angeles area and happen to be looking for software development agencies, you might run into Patrick Ward. Patrick is the director of marketing at Rootstrap, and he's the founder of NanoGlobals, where he helps mid-sized tech companies tap into their global markets using an expert-led platform. And if you think that Patrick is a Los Angeles native, you would be wrong. He's quite global and has traveled around the world, spent a lot of time in the Asia-Pacific area, and was a copyright nomad. If you're intrigued about who Patrick is, you're not alone. But what Patrick is about to communicate is much more intriguing. Part 1. Keep the job in perspective. So much of our lives, and as much as people don't want to admit it, our identities are tied to the work that we do. Unfortunately, when the work gets tough, when the pressures are high, it affects us emotionally, mentally, and it can wear us out. Patrick has a way of putting all this in perspective. He shares a story that gets at the heart of this perspective. Here's Patrick.
I just joined my current role at Rootstrap. So I've been in the technology space for a number of years. This was early on, so we were still getting to know each other, myself being head of marketing and my VP of sales. So together we're responsible for revenue. And he once said to me, and this was because his father is an emergency room surgeon, and he said, "Look, Patrick, at the end of the day, we're not saving lives, we're just selling software." And I think this phrase has always really stuck with me because so often in the corporate world or in any sort of company, what ends up happening is people get tied to deadlines. They get very stressed about those deadlines. They worry about their boss's expectations. They worry about the company's expectations. And often this means that we overblow what we do as humans and we forget what's really important. And I think this has been a really important lesson for me because often when people ask, well, you seem such a good leader, you must have had a lot of good mentors in your past. And that's true, but I've never had many good leaders in my past. More often than not, the way that I say I've become a good leader now is because I stumbled into it. And I stumbled into it because most of the leaders I had were not what I consider leaders. They were managers. They were bosses who created unrealistic expectations. They were managers who took credit for my work and didn't shine a light on my achievements. They were managers who created unrealistic deadlines. All throughout those lessons, as much as they were tough, and I thought at the time, hey, maybe I just have to grind through this for a while, it's a narrative that I've countered very intentionally against when I come to my current employees of making sure that they don't feel those things.
What you were just describing to me is what I call traditional leadership. And that's where I actually use the word leader in the sense of what's traditionally thought about leadership. And that is you're managing through authority. You need to be the smartest person in the room. Worst situation, like you described it, which is just horrible, where you take credit for the work of other people, your team, and downplay what they do. I mean, it's just like the antithesis of leadership in the 21st century.
Absolutely. It doesn't make any sense to me because at the end of the day, I think my role as a leader is to identify talent and to support talent in realizing its potential. The classic example I give is I currently have 2 direct reports, one who is responsible for demand generation, one who is responsible for content. Now, I hired them knowing they have the skills, they have the experience, they have the knowledge, they have the curiosity, they have all of these elements that it makes them very successful. And my only job is to make sure they don't have any roadblocks in their way to that success.
So you let them think.
Yeah, it's crazy how it seems so natural in the sense of this is how to be a good person and to treat others with respect. And yet I get the same consistent feedback from them of you're the best boss we've ever had, which is pleasing and yet damning, I find, on the state of the corporate world. I feel like we are starting to wake up to this reality that, like you said, traditional leadership as it has been perceived of like slave driving people, forcing them to hit deadlines, being the smartest person in the room. I'm hoping that is starting to be put to one side in favor of this supportive, nurturing, coaching type mentality that I think is the true way to realize people's potential.
I would wager to say that when you're working with someone, if you have, for example, a new employee who's more at the, I guess, junior level or less experienced, you would assume more of a coaching role, not because you're trying to be more traditional, but because you're mentoring and helping that person to develop. Part of my wager is that when that person has confidence and competence in particular tasks, your role changes to what you described as just removing roadblocks and providing support.
Absolutely. It's very important to recognize that when someone has talent and is therefore not being successful in their role, it's not them. It is some external factor. Either they don't have enough resources or their effort is being misdirected. And that is not on them. That is on you as a leader to help them uncover that rather than blame them. This has been a real sticking point for me that I've seen in the past where leaders, rather than supporting their staff, use their staff as scapegoats. Oh, this initiative didn't work out or it wasn't profitable. Blame that person, have that person fired. That is not a constructive culture. It is a very toxic culture. I've been in that culture more times than I can count. And I've deliberately wanted the culture that I create within my teams so they can feel psychologically safe. They can feel able to take risks. They can feel able to be creative. Come up with that quirky idea that maybe no one else has thought about. And maybe we can run an experiment and see whether it works or not, but not have the fear that if they do something and they fail, it will be a lesson. It's not going to result in them being fired.
Not many people in management, even at the executive level, recognizes that when something goes wrong, you don't necessarily need to point at the person closest. It could be something outside of what's going on down the up or down the chain of events. It could be confused expectations, not receiving the right resources, skills, need to develop some skills. You're right. Firing someone does not necessarily solve the problem, and it sure isn't the healthiest way of interacting and treating employees.
Absolutely. It's funny, those same types of companies that I've been in the past, which have responded that way, then are the ones who complain, 6 months, a year later, oh, we seem to be having a retention problem. It's like, well, of course you have a retention problem because everyone is fearful. Everyone is working at the bare minimum just to save themselves rather than doing truly innovative work in order to push the organization to the next level. I think about this all the time when I think about the environments I've been in where I haven't felt psychologically safe. And then I take a measure of how much work I'm putting in. And I think I'm putting in 51%. I'm putting in just enough work to keep this job. And the other 49% is finding a new job. Meanwhile, if I'm in a space where I feel safe and able to be creative and innovative, I put in naturally more work for the company, not because I necessarily have the desire for some particular executive to get credit, but I do it because I feel supported. And if I feel supported, I want to repay that support back to the organization. So needless to say, when I approach it as a leader, I want to make sure that, hey, my employees are getting enough out of this experience as I am getting from their efforts and their work put in for me as a leader.
Part 2, Enable employees to perform. After talking with colleagues, reading articles, watching videos, it seems to me that there's an increase in investing in managers to help them to lead. Maybe my perception's skewed, maybe it isn't, but it seems that certain things have highlighted the need for leadership, in particular the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, and all the heated politics of the last few years. Or maybe companies like Gallup have done a really good job at raising awareness of the relationship between managers and employees. Patrick shares a straightforward view of this relationship, the manager-employee relationship, and the way he describes it makes it seem so obvious what managers need to do. Here's Patrick with his perceptions and stories.
Needless to say, the pandemic has been a massive disruptor.
Yeah.
It wasn't a huge disruption to me compared to a lot of others. I myself had experience as a digital nomad. I used to be a copywriter and I lived and worked around Southeast Asia for a long time. So that world of communicating to people virtually, that wasn't new. But what was new about the pandemic for me is that I was being responsible for a team and I was acutely aware of the mental health pressures that were going to come out of the pandemic. Obviously, we were all very fortunate. We were still employed. We were in an industry, namely technology, that allows us to do our work remotely. But I knew that going into this pandemic, this is around March of 2020, that I needed to step up as a leader, not just taking for granted that people were going to be able to be as productive as they were. Because either they were going to be extra productive, but then closer to burnout, or they were going to be less productive because they were feeling scared, worried about their situation. So I instituted a very simple procedure, and it was a daily stand-up. And it started at 9 a.m. in the morning, a half hour, and it was specifically set with the expectations. This is not to talk about work. If you want to bring up something about work or a task or a blocker you have, you can. But really, it's just an open space for our team to gather and talk about what's going on in the world, keep socializing with one another. Now, the funny thing is about every one of our team members is in a different space. I was in LA. My content manager was in New York. My demand generation manager was in New Jersey. I had an account manager down in Uruguay. So we're all separate. At the time, I thought this is a very simple process. It just keeps the camaraderie. This is a good thing. What I didn't realize the impact of this until much later in the year, probably around December of 2020, when we were doing performance reviews. I got the feedback from my team members who said the daily stand-up was the thing that kept me psychologically sane during this year.
Wow.
That was a powerful moment to realize that this small little task of meeting 30 minutes a day was what kept people connected with one another, was what helped us be super productive, but also just genuinely happy during what was otherwise a pretty horrific year by all accounts. I think if you asked anyone, was 2020 their favorite year of their life, most people would probably say no. It was just a really nice moment for me to see that, leadership doesn't have to be the biggest grandstanding statements or proclamations. Sometimes it can just be in a simple human-based interaction that is done day to day.
Before the pandemic hit, was your team already remote?
So some of us were remote, but a large percentage of us was here in LA. While we weren't, and we were still doing a couple of days a week remotely, so it wasn't totally foreign to us. I think what was really foreign to us is that inability to go outside.
Yeah.
That really obviously hits in a different way. It's not so much that we're communicating with each other differently. It's just that the entire context around that was different. And so I think where this manifested itself in those daily meetings is any one of our employees felt comfortable saying, hey guys, I'm not feeling it today. Or I'm not creative today. And we would adjust. We would adjust each day by day. I think that was really important for everyone to feel okay with not always being 100% productive, because I think the in-person world that we were in prior to the pandemic made this artificial expectation. Oh, you have to put in 8 hours of work a day. Well, newsflash, most statistics say that you get about 57% of an employee's workday actually dedicated to quote unquote constructive work. Like, the human mind is just incapable of working like a machine 8 hours at the exact same productivity level all day.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that, and that's okay. When I focus on my team members, I listen and learn what is their ideal working style. One guy I have prefers to set aside some writing time, put himself, in a closet, if you will, and just write for 4 hours. I'm like, okay, I'll create the space for you to do that. Another one prefers more constant interaction and brainstorming. Okay, I'll set up additional meetings so we can do that. But that's the key with leadership, learning how each person individually has their own personality style, their own working style, and just allowing that to flourish in your organization so that you can get the absolute best out of each individual employee.
And having that knowledge is what enables you to provide the support to remove barriers and also to enable them to express when they've, I guess, make it safe for them to express when they're too exhausted or when something personal is going on, so that it's okay to say that. And it sounds like your whole team is very adaptable.
Well, here's the big reason why I do that. It's funny, when I speak with other people, they almost are shocked that, wow, you would ask your employees and you would be happy when they say, hey, I'm not feeling so good today, or I've got a personal issue come up. I love that for a specific reason, because when I was an employee, I remember feeling that disgruntlement and not expressing it to my manager until the day that there's my 2 weeks notice. And I am terrified of that happening to me as a leader. I constantly want to be making myself available, making myself supportive to my employees so that they can always come to me with a problem, so we can talk about it, tackle it before it's an issue, before it comes to a case of, here's my 2 weeks notice. I would hope that if any of my employees ever did leave to go on to bigger and better things, I would have known about it well in advance, because that to me is truly about building a transparent, honest trust between manager and employee.
This is the part where I would say, Amen. I wanted to go back and briefly just comment on something you said that struck me, that when the pandemic was starting, when everyone was going remote, you were concerned that some people would become too productive and experience burnout, and some people would be less productive just because of all that's going on around them. And I think that's extremely insightful that a lot of people missed when all this was starting.
Well, first of all, there was the denial. Everyone thought, I heard the same sort of things that will be done by June.
Yeah.
I certainly knew that wasn't going to be the case. My mother is a medical professional, and I asked her, how long is it going to be till a vaccine? And she's like, 12 to 18 months. Okay, there we go. So that's how long minimum we've got to deal with this. And so then I'm thinking, what are the psychological ramifications of us not being able to have these incidental social interactions? Because we forget that. We forget that when you're in the office, we have a term for it, the water cooler conversation, right?
Yeah.
Just, even if you don't speak to a lot of people that much, maybe you've got your head down on a project, you still do have these little micro social interaction. As soon as you go fully remote, and I knew this implicitly as a digital nomad, unless you carve out deliberate time for it, you will not have that. And so it's really important to think about, hey, if you're an introvert and you don't want to speak to many people, that's great. But I knew, being in marketing, and therefore a lot of my marketing team are extroverts, and they're going to need that social interaction, that social support. Just because work can be done remotely, and obviously there are arguments for and against remote work, you've still got to tailor your approach to it. I've seen too many friends of mine who have been in the unfortunate situation of being inundated with meetings, expected to do all the same work they were doing in an in-person capacity, And suddenly, what does that mean? They're working 10, 12, 14-hour days. I have no interest in any of my team doing that because I will burn them out to the point that either they are not productive or they leave the organization. And we all know that is a very costly thing, not only for the employee to leave with all their institutional knowledge, for the costs that it takes for hiring someone new. It's just much easier and better for everyone if you retain happy, healthy employees.
Part 3, balance autonomy and accountability. With the leadership principle, give up control, there's some underlying beliefs. Here are a few of them. Control erodes relationships. Leading well is about empowering others. And command and control is a shared responsibility. The principle and those beliefs they're simple. They may seem easy to grasp, but it's difficult to put them in practice. However, Patrick has put this principle and these beliefs into practice, and the stories you've already heard illustrate this. Patrick advises us on how we can do a better job at leading, and incidentally, how we can do a better job of giving up control and following these beliefs that I just mentioned. Here's Patrick.
The key with any form of leadership is being more than comfortable with providing considerable autonomy. And what I want to dive into here is you as a leader are providing direction. You are providing perhaps a goal framework in which your team operates, but you should not be dictating the how. You have hired people who are experienced. You have hired people who have the knowledge, the intellect, and arguably should have more knowledge than you. And if you can be comfortable with that and you leave the how up to them, you will get results that are far in excess of whatever your expectations are. And I want to lead with this with a concrete example. So when I joined my current company, a software development agency, I came from a previous competitor, and my task was very simple. We are an outbound focused company. We want to be inbound focused. So I was given a year to do it. Now, I could have dictated every single step of every single channel and got it done within the year, but I didn't. I made people responsible for it. I said, look, here's the overall goal we're trying to get to, but your area is this. You need to be responsible for it, and I trust you to do it. If you have a problem or a blocker, come to me, but I don't need to be hearing what you're doing at all hours of the day. Now, that was a lot of faith, and particularly with these two employees I brought on, I trusted my hiring process, yet neither of them had been in our industry before, but they demonstrated some skills of curiosity, of willingness to experiment, that I thought that's going to be sufficient for what this requires. And within that 12 months, I was expecting maybe we've turned around maybe half, maybe 75%. I felt like I could sell that to the executives. But then they far exceeded those expectations to the point that they generated $18 million in pipeline for our business, where the executives had never seen this before. And again, when it came to that performance review, both of them said, well, why did you take a chance on us? Why did you do that? We hadn't been in tech before. And again, I said, because you have the soft skills, you had the willingness to learn the skills you didn't have, you had all the right attitudes that I knew that you would be successful as long as I provided you with the tools and resources you needed to be successful. And that is really important for leaders to let go of that control. A lot of leaders lean into micromanagement because they feel that that's the only way to get results. The fact is, if you let go of the reins, you actually end up being more successful, not only as a department, not only as a company, but as a leader yourself.
When you take the time and you set those expectations, you clarify where you need to be, where they need to arrive at, and you give them permission, in a sense, to own the how, that goes a long ways. And you wouldn't need to micromanage if you've done a good job at setting those expectations.
Absolutely. It's bizarre to me, and maybe it's because of quarterly reporting, maybe it's because of other leaders having excessive egos, but it's bizarre to me that they try and be experts on everything. I would much rather build up my own experts under me who end up teaching me a lot more, and they will always deliver. Now, you have to have faith. It's a scary process. There were times there, I'll give one example. There were times there where my demand generation manager was running experiments. I think it went 4 or 5 months where nothing materialized from those experiments, like literally $0 in revenue. But they learned, they kept experimenting, and sure enough, by the end of the year, that particular bucket had generated $3 million in deals. But you have to have some faith, because again, we go back to something we said earlier. You need to trust that when people are working hard and they're putting in effort and they're being creative and they're innovating, if the results are not coming yet, it's not their fault. You need to allow them the space so they can truly analyze what's working, what's not working, why is it not working, and then you can provide the additional support, the additional pivot, or the additional resources.
My thanks to Patrick Ward. If you'd like to learn more about Patrick, go to the show notes. If you have a question or a comment, go to unlabelleadership.com, click the message icon, and you can leave a voicemail message up to 1 minute. I'd like to thank those who help out and contribute to the show to help with the production cost. I'm hoping to get to the point where I can have transcripts for those who have hearing disabilities. Mostly, thank you for listening. Until next time, lead on.